The folded papers hit the table between them like a gunshot, and Grady stared at them without breathing. Arthur Norris stood on the other side of that scarred wooden surface, his jaw tight, his dark eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. Dust from the road still clung to his coat. His hands, which she had watched do things she would never be able to unsee, rested flat against the table now, pressing down as though he needed to anchor himself to something solid. "Pick them up," he said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that showing feeling was the same as showing weakness. Della did not pick them up. She looked at him instead, searching his face for the trap, for the hidden motive she had been trained by bitter experience to find in every gesture a man made toward her. "What is this?" she whispered. "You can read, you know what it is." She reached out slowly and unfolded the papers. The official seal of Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory, 1882, the careful bureaucratic script of a government clerk. And there at the bottom, written in Arthur Norris's own hand, cramped and deliberate as everything else about him, the name of the new registered owner of one dark bay mare named Copper. Her name, Della Grady. The betrayal she felt was strange, because it moved backward through her chest like something she had expected and dreaded in equal measure. She had known this was coming. She had told herself not to trust him. She had been so certain that the moment she let herself believe Arthur Norris was something other than what the wanted posters said he was, he would do exactly this. He would hand her something that looked like kindness and turn it into a chain. "Why?" she said, and the word barely made sound. He looked away from her toward the window, toward the pale afternoon sky over Roswell, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. "Because I might not be around much longer," he said, "and that horse gets you 40 miles out of this territory before anyone knows you are gone." She stood up so fast the chair scraped backward against the plank floor. "You are running," she said. "You have been planning to run and leave me here." "I am planning to keep you alive," he said, turning back to her, and there it was, the thing behind his eyes she had not been able to name. It was not coldness. It was not the flat criminal emptiness she had assigned to him in the beginning because she had needed him to be simple, to be dangerous and nothing more, so that she would not have to feel anything about him. It was fear. Arthur Norris was afraid, not for himself, for her. 3 weeks earlier, Della Grady had not known this man existed. 3 weeks earlier, she had been trying to survive the worst night of her life on a lonesome stretch of road between Santa Fe and nowhere, and the only thing standing between her and a very dark ending had been a stranger on a dark bay horse who had no good reason to stop. She had been traveling alone because she had no choice. The stagecoach from Santa Fe had broken an axle 12 miles outside of a town called Picacho, and the driver had told the 4 passengers they could wait for the next coach in 2 days or walk. The other 3 passengers had been men, and they had decided to walk. Della had decided to wait because she had $40 sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, and a satchel of medical supplies that weighed more than she could comfortably carry 12 miles in the August heat of New Mexico Territory. She was 26 years old, trained as a nurse in St. Louis, and she had come to New Mexico Territory because a doctor named Harlan Grady, her father's cousin twice removed, had written to her father that he needed assistance in his practice in Roswell and could offer a wage. Her father had been dead for 4 months and her mother for 3 years before that, and Della had a younger brother named James who was 15 and needed feeding, and the $40 in her bag represented everything she had left after booking 2 train tickets west and 1 stagecoach connection. James was waiting in Santa Fe with a widow named Mrs. Pelham who ran a respectable boarding house and had agreed to look after the boy for 1 week. If Della did not reach Roswell, confirm the position with Dr. Grady and send word back. James had instructions to return east to Cincinnati and present himself to their Uncle Porter, who was a difficult man but not a cruel one and would probably provide. That was the plan. It was not a good plan. It was the only plan. When the three men who had decided to walk doubled back along the road 2 hours after sunset, they were no longer interested in walking. They had found a bottle somewhere, or perhaps they had been carrying it all along, and the dark and the liquor and the isolation had changed their calculation about what the night could offer. Della heard them before she saw them. She had climbed up onto the disabled stagecoach's roof because she had a feeling, the way her mother had always said women developed feelings about danger if they were smart enough to listen to them. She lay flat on the coach roof in the dark and watched the three men come back down the road and circle the coach and call out to her with voices that started friendly and turned ugly when she did not answer. She had a small knife in her boot. She would have used it. She had been prepared to use it. She did not need to. The sound of a horse at a hard canter came out of the darkness from the north, and the rider pulled up short near the coach, and the three men turned to look. And in the moonlight Della saw a man on a dark bay horse who was large enough and still enough that the three men below her did a rapid recalculation. Problem here, the rider said. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply existed in that moment with a quality of absolute certainty that Della would later spend a great deal of time trying to describe to herself. The three men said no. There was no problem. They were just passing through. Then pass through, the rider said. They did. He sat on his horse in the dark for a while after they were gone, and then he looked up at the roof of the stagecoach. You can come down now, he said. She climbed down carefully, her legs shaking in a way she was very angry about, and she stood in the road and looked up at him and said the first stupid thing that came into her mind. How did you know I was up there? You breathe loud, he said. When you are scared. She did not know whether to be embarrassed or furious. She settled on something in between. Thank you, she said. Where are you headed, Roswell? He looked at the disabled coach, and then at the darkness around them, and then back at her, with an expression that communicated a very clear opinion about the situation without using any words. I can pay for escort, she said, because she was practical even when she was scared, and because the $40 was going to have to stretch a great deal further, and she was not in a position to be generous. But she was also not in a position to spend the night alone on a road where those three men might return. Keep your money, he said, and swung down from the horse. That was the beginning, not romantic, not soft. He unsaddled his horse and tied her to the coach wheel and rolled his blanket out on the ground nearby, and Della sat on the coach step and watched him do it with her knife still in her boot and her heart still hammering. What is your name? She asked. A pause, long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Arthur, he said. Arthur what? Another pause. Norris, he said finally, as though he was testing how the name sounded out loud after a period of not using it. She would not know until 3 days later when they reached Roswell and she saw the wanted poster in the sheriff's office window, that Arthur Norris was a name the law enforcement of 3 territories knew very well indeed. The poster said he was wanted for robbery, for conspiracy, and for the murder of a man named Cole Whitfield in Tucson, Arizona Territory, in 1880. It said he was considered armed and dangerous. It said there was a reward of $500 for his capture, alive, and $250 for information leading to same. Della had stood on the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office and looked at the poster for a very long time. Then she had turned around and walked to the hotel where Arthur Norris had paid for 2 separate rooms without comment or suggestion, the way a man does when he is making a point, and she had knocked on his door. He opened it. He was in his shirt sleeves. He looked at her face and seemed to understand immediately what she had seen. I did not kill Cole Whitfield, he said, before she could speak. He did not say it defensively. He said it the way a man states a fact he is very tired of having to state. I did not ask, she said. You were going to. I was going to say thank you, she said, properly, for 3 days of riding and not saying much and keeping me safe when you had no reason to. He looked at her as though she had said something in a language he did not entirely speak. I also want to ask you, she said, whether you know anything about the territory between here and Lincoln County, because I have to go to Lincoln County next week with Dr. Grady for a patient visit, and I have been told there is some difficulty with the road. The difficulty with the road, as she had been told it by Dr. Harlan Grady over supper on her first evening in Roswell, was that a man named Silas Creed had set himself up as something between a land baron and a small-scale tyrant in the stretch of country between Roswell and the town of Lincoln, and he was collecting what he called a road toll from travelers and what everyone else called robbery, and the sheriff of Lincoln County was on Creed's payroll, which meant there was no legal recourse. And the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe was aware of the situation, but claimed it was a territorial matter. Dr. Grady was 61 years old, in poor health, and desperately needed to see his patient in Lincoln, a woman named Mrs. Aldecoa, who had a pregnancy complication that required medical attention and could not travel. He had made the trip twice already with armed escort and paid the toll both times, which had cost him more than he could afford. He needed to make the trip a third time. He could not afford to pay the toll again. This was the situation into which Della Grady had arrived. It was more complicated than the advertisement had suggested. She had explained it to Arthur Norris in the doorway of his hotel room, because she was already decided about it, and explaining it aloud helped her think. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You are asking me to ride with you through Creed's territory," he said. "I am informing you of the situation," she said. "You can decide what you want to do with the information." He had decided to stay in Roswell. She had known he would. He had no reason to do otherwise, and she had not allowed herself to want him to decide differently. She was a woman who was very good at not allowing herself to want things she could not have. She had been practicing for years. The next morning he was in the stable when she went to check on the horse she had borrowed from Dr. Grady, a placid old sorrel named Benjamin, who was better suited to hauling a buggy than carrying a rider in a hurry. Arthur was there with Copper, his dark bay mare, brushing her out with the focused attention he gave to everything, which was to say complete and unhurried. "You never told me what you are doing in Roswell," Della said, because the silence felt like an opportunity. "Passing through," he said. "On your way to where?" He was quiet. "You do not know," she said, not an accusation, an observation. He stopped brushing. He looked at the mare's flank for a moment. "No," he said, "I do not know." That was the second thing that changed the texture of how she understood him. The first had been that he breathed loud when he was scared, which was not something she had ever expected a man like him to admit about himself, even second-hand. The second was that he did not know where he was going, and he said it without shame, just with the quiet honesty of a man who has run out of pretense. There is something about that kind of honesty that is harder to resist than charm. Della had been charmed before and had learned to recognize the hollowness inside it. She did not know what to do with something real. She told herself it did not matter. She had a position here. She had her brother to send for. She had work to do. Arthur Norris was not her concern. He was in the stable again the next morning, and the morning after that. He had settled his account at the hotel and was sleeping in the stable loft, which the stable owner, a taciturn man named Horace, had apparently agreed to without much discussion. Della came to check on Benjamin every morning because the old sorrel was developing a softness in one front leg that worried her, and Dr. Grady had asked her to keep an eye on it, and every morning Arthur was there. They did not talk much. That was, she realized slowly, one of the things that was different about him. He did not fill silence with noise the way most people did. He was not uncomfortable with quiet. He was comfortable in it, the way an animal is comfortable in its own territory. And that should have been alienating, a man that's self-contained. But instead she found herself relaxing in his company in a way she had not relaxed since her father died. On the fifth morning she brought him coffee from the small cafe across the street, because she had bought a cup for herself, and it seemed wasteful not to. He took it without comment and drank it standing next to Copper's stall, and they stood there together in the early light with the smell of hay and horses and coffee. And Della thought about how strange it was that this was the most peaceful she had felt in a very long time. "Tell me about Cole Whitfield," she said. He did not answer right away. She waited. "He was my partner," Arthur said finally. "For 4 years. We ran together out of the Arizona territory, banks mostly, staged lines a few times." He paused. "I am not going to pretend I was something I was not." "I am not asking you to," she said. Whitfield decided one day that 4 years of splitting take down the middle was 4 years too many. He decided he wanted all of it. Arthur's voice was even. "He set me up for a job in Tucson that was supposed to be a Wells Fargo payroll transfer. Turned out the law was waiting. 3 men I rode with got killed. I got out. Whitfield walked away with the money and I walked away with a murder charge because when they looked at the dead men and then looked at who had gotten out alive, the arithmetic made me the obvious answer." Della turned to look at him directly. "But you did not kill them." "Whitfield killed them," he said. "He told the law before we even rode and what the plan was and who the riders were, because they offered him the reward money and an amnesty. He just did not tell anyone until after the shooting was done, which meant I had nowhere to go that was not a wanted poster." He said it without bitterness, which she found almost harder to listen to than bitterness would have been. Bitterness she understood. This flat recounting of a betrayal so complete it had cost him everything, delivered without apparent self-pity, was something else. "Where is Whitfield now?" she asked. "Dead," Arthur said. "Not by my hand. He took the reward money and drank it away in 6 months, and then he got into a card game in Albuquerque with a man who was a worse person than Whitfield was, and that was the end of that. And there is no way to clear the charge." "The law does not tend to clear charges against men like me," he said quietly. "Not in this territory, not in this decade." She thought about that, about what it meant to carry a name that everyone had already decided was guilty. About the dark past that followed him like a second shadow wherever he went, making every road the wrong road and every town a temporary one. "I am sorry," she said. He looked at her, and for a moment something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite surprise and not quite grief but lived somewhere between them. "You are the first person to say that to me," he said, "who was not being paid to say it." She left his coffee cup with him and walked back across the street to the doctor's office, and she did not let herself think about the look on his face for the rest of the day. She almost succeeded. On the 7th day, Dr. Grady told her he had to make the trip to Lincoln within the week, shoulder toll or no shoulder toll. Mrs. Aldecoa's condition had worsened by report, and he could not in good conscience delay further. He had hired 2 men to escort them, local riders named Burl and Tom, who were willing enough but who Della could tell immediately were the kind of willing that stops being willing when the situation gets complicated. She packed the medical bags. She wrote to James in Santa Fe and told him she was established and to come on the next coach when he could manage it, and she gave him Mrs. Pelham's address for reference and told him to be polite and not lose anything. She was methodical about it. She did not let herself think about the trip ahead. The morning they were to leave, Arthur Norris was standing in front of the stable with Copper saddled and a bedroll behind the cantle, and he was looking at the sky with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not entirely sure how he arrived at it. Della stopped walking and looked at him. "You did not tell me you were leaving," she said, and was immediately annoyed at herself for saying it because she had no claim on his movements and no right to sound like she did. "I am not," he said. He looked at her. "I am riding with you to Lincoln." She opened her mouth and closed it again. "Dr. Grady," Arthur said, "already agreed. I spoke to him last night." "You spoke to Dr. Grady. He needs an escort he can trust through Creed's Stretch. I know that road." She understood then in a way that worked its way down through her chest like warm water that he had done this quietly and practically, and without making a performance of it, which was exactly how he did everything. He had not told her. He had arranged it with the person who needed to be consulted and then presented it as settled. There was something so characteristically Arthur about it that she had to look away for a moment. "You know you are riding into Lincoln County with a wanted poster on your name," she said. "The sheriff of Lincoln County is crooked," he said. Crooked sheriffs are not typically enthusiastic about engaging with men who might make things complicated for them. It was a certain kind of logic, not the safest logic, but a kind. The ride to Lincoln took 2 days. Dr. Grady rode the buggy with his medical bags and old Benjamin hitched between the traces because his knees were bad and the buggy was easier than a saddle. Burl and Tom rode ahead, somewhat uselessly, spending most of their attention on each other's conversation. Arthur rode beside Della, who had been given the loan of a horse from Dr. Grady's neighbor, a compact gray gelding named Pilot that had better gaits than his appearance suggested. They entered Creed's stretch of road on the morning of the second day, and Della felt the change in Arthur before she saw it. He became quieter, which was saying something, and his attention expanded outward in that way she had noticed that night on the road to Roswell, when the 3 drunk men had been circling the disabled coach. He was watching everything. All of it at once, with a quality of alert stillness that reminded her of a hawk on a fence post. Silas Creed's men appeared at a bend in the road about 4 miles into the stretch. There were 3 of them, armed and confident, positioned across the road with the ease of men who did this regularly and expected no real resistance. Creed himself was not there. He sent his men, which told Della something about how he calculated risks. The leader of the 3 was a heavy-set man with a red beard who announced the toll with the bored efficiency of a railroad conductor announcing a stop. $3 per rider, $5 for the wagon. Non-negotiable. The money to be produced before the party proceeded. Burl and Tom looked at each other. Burl started to reach for his money. Arthur moved Copper forward 2 steps, which was enough to put himself between the red-bearded man and the rest of the party, and he said, in that low, certain voice, "We are carrying a physician to attend a medical emergency. This party passes without toll." The red-bearded man looked at Arthur with the assessing look of a man whose job is to identify problems and eliminate them. Whatever he saw in Arthur's face, whatever the calculation came out to, he did not push. "Doc can pass," the man said after a moment. "Toll still applies to the others." "The others are the doctor's party," Arthur said. "Medical escort passes without toll." There was a silence that had weight to it. Della kept her face still and her hands relaxed on the reins and told herself to breathe. The red-bearded man looked at Arthur for 3 more seconds. Then he moved his horse to the side of the road. "Pass on," he said, as though it was his own decision, which perhaps in some narrow technical sense it was. They rode through without stopping, without paying, without looking back. When they were a mile past the bend and the trees had closed behind them, Burl let out a long breath and said something about needing a drink. Dr. Grady said nothing, but patted the seat of his buggy with one hand in what appeared to be a gesture of silent relief. Tom looked straight ahead. Della looked at Arthur, who was watching the road behind them with that hawk-on-a-fence-post attention. "They will report to Creed," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "Will Creed send more men? Possibly. After the fact," he glanced at her. "I will handle it if he does." "You have a particular talent," she said carefully, "for putting yourself between trouble and other people." Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Force of habit," he said, and looked at the road ahead. They reached Lincoln that evening and delivered Dr. Grady to the Aldecoa house, where Mrs. Aldecoa's husband, a rancher named Ramon Aldecoa, met them at the gate with the anxious gratitude of a man who has been very frightened for very long. The doctor went inside. Burl and Tom found a saloon. Della helped with what she could in the early examination, and then came outside onto the porch because Dr. Grady said the patient needed rest and quiet, and would Della please bring the bag from the buggy. She was bringing the bag from the buggy when she found Arthur behind the barn, washing his hands and face from a pump, and she stopped walking because she had not expected to find him doing something so ordinary. He looked up. Water ran off his jaw. In the long gold light of the desert evening he looked younger than she had understood him to be, and she had a sudden involuntary apprehension of how he must have looked at 20 before whatever had happened to him had happened. She was 26. He was, she estimated, 30 or thereabouts, Not so very different. How old are you? She asked, because she was already asking things today that she had not planned to ask. 31, he said. I am 26, she said, as though the exchange of that information was useful. He looked at her with something that might, if the light were different and she were less careful, have been called tenderness. I know, he said. Doctor. Grady mentioned it. Dr. Grady, she said, talks a great deal. He does, Arthur agreed, and there was the smallest hint of something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and Della felt it hit her squarely in the chest in a way she was wholly unprepared for. She turned and walked back toward the house with the medical bag, because there were things she was not yet ready to feel and she needed more time. Over the 2 days they spent in Lincoln, while Dr. Grady attended to Mrs. Aldecoa and monitored her progress, Della found herself understanding Arthur Norris in a way that felt dangerous. Dangerous because the more she understood him, the harder it became to maintain the practical distance she had set between them as a matter of sense and self-preservation. He helped Ramon Aldecoa with fencing repair without being asked, not talking much but working steadily through the heat of the day with the focused competence he brought to everything physical. She watched him from the window of the sick room while she sat with Mrs. Aldecoa, who was 32 and tired and frightened in the particular way of women who have been frightened for a long time and have become skilled at hiding it. Your man, Mrs. Aldecoa said, following Della's gaze out the window. He is a good worker. He is not my man, Della said. Mrs. Aldecoa smiled in the patient way of a woman who has been told many things that are not quite accurate. Of course not, she said, and closed her eyes. On the second evening, after the patient was sleeping and Dr. Grady was reviewing his notes, Della walked out to the corral and found Arthur there with Copper, not doing anything particular, just standing next to the horse with one hand on her neck, looking at the sky. The sky in New Mexico territory at dusk was something she had not been prepared for when she came from Missouri. It was extraordinary in the way that things are extraordinary when they are too large for any prior experience to have prepared you. The colors that moved through it in the half hour before full dark were colors she did not have adequate names for. She stood beside him and looked up at it. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. I looked at the wanted poster very carefully, she said. The one in Roswell. All right. There was an inconsistency in it, she said. The date of the incident in Tucson. It says you were present at the Wells Fargo location on March 14, 1880. But the deposition from Whitfield, which was also posted because someone had thought it would be useful to display their evidence, says he informed law enforcement of the plan on March 12th. She paused. A man who was present at the planning stage of a robbery does not typically wait 2 days before informing the law. He would do it immediately, or he would not do it at all. The 2-day gap suggests he was planning the information as a separate event, which means he likely knew what was going to happen at that location on the 14th before the robbery was planned, which means the whole thing was arranged by someone other than your gang, and you rode into it. Arthur was very still. You are saying, he said slowly, that you spent time reading a wanted poster well enough to find a timeline inconsistency in it. I read everything carefully, she said. It is a habit. My father was a lawyer. He turned to look at her then fully with an expression she had not seen on him before. She could not name it. She had no category for it. You are the most surprising person I have met, he said, in 31 years. She looked back at the sky because if she kept looking at him, she was going to do something she had decided firmly she was not going to do. It might not matter in terms of the law, she said. But I thought you should know that someone who looks carefully can see that it was not how they say it was. He did not say anything for a long time. The sky went from coral to indigo to the first dark of a western night, and the stars appeared one at a time in the way that stars appear when there are no city lights to compete with them. My mother's name was Della, he said suddenly, quietly, as though the sentence had simply risen to the surface from somewhere deep. She absorbed this. She said. She died when I was 16, fever, he paused. I have not said her name out loud in a while. This was the moment. She could feel it, the precise moment when the thing she had been managing with enormous care became unmanageable, when the careful distance collapsed. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because he said his dead mother's name in the dark next to her, and she understood that this was a man who had been alone for a very long time and who did not know what to do with not being alone. She did not touch him. She stood there next to him, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and she looked at the stars. "It is a good name," she said softly. "Yes," he said, "it is." They rode back to Roswell the next day, all 5 of them, and Creed's men did not appear, which Arthur had not expected but which was a relief regardless. When they arrived back in town in the late afternoon, and the party dispersed, and Dr. Grady went home to his house on the west end of town, and Burl and Tom went their separate ways, Della stood in front of the hotel with her traveling bag and thought about what came next. Arthur was unsaddling Copper in the stable. She could see him through the wide doors. She walked in. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. He looked at her over Copper's back. "I thought I would stay a few more days," he said. "Make sure Creed does not decide to send a message." "Is that the reason?" she said. A pause. "It is a reason," he said. She thought about what to say next and then decided that she had been being practical for long enough and that being practical had its limits. "I have been offered a small house on the edge of town," she said. "Dr. Grady's sister-in-law moved to Albuquerque and left her place. It needs some work. I am going to take it. My brother James is coming from Santa Fe in about 10 days. She stopped. "I am telling you this because I would like you to know where I am, not because I have any claim on you or any expectations, just because I would like you to know." He was very still. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and turned and walked out into the late afternoon with her heart doing something loud and undignified in her chest. He came to the house 2 days later with his coat off, and a set of tools she did not know he had acquired, and he fixed the step that was rotting and the shutter hinge that had been giving her trouble and the gap in the window frame where the desert wind came through at night. He worked quietly, and she brought him water, and they talked in the way that people who have already said important things to each other can talk, which is to say without obligation, roaming across topics without needing to make sense of the sequence. She learned that he had grown up in Colorado, in a mining town, that his father had worked the mines and died of the lung disease that took so many miners, that he had a brother somewhere in Kansas who did not know where he was, and whom he had not contacted in years because he did not want to bring trouble to him, that he had started riding with rough men at 17 because rough men were what was available and he had needed to eat, and that it had taken him a very long time to understand that he had a choice in it. "Did you ever rob anyone who could not afford it?" she asked once, not making a judgment, just asking. He thought about it seriously. "Wells Fargo could afford it," he said. "The stage line we hit twice was owned by a man named Caswell who had made his money in a way I will not detail but which had cost a number of people a great deal. I am not trying to make myself a Robin Hood. I am just telling you the truth of it." She believed him. She was not sure she should, but she did. She wrote to James with the new address. She organized the small house, 2 rooms and a kitchen, into a functioning space, and she began her work with Dr. Grady, which turned out to be more varied and demanding than she had expected. Roswell in 1882 was a small but growing town, with a population that mixed ranchers and their hands, a few merchants and their families, some Mexicans and some Apache who moved in and out of the territory, and all the various difficulties that came with people living hard lives in a hard landscape. She set broken arms, cleaned infected wounds, sat with dying men when their families were not present, delivered a baby in the 3rd week that was too early but survived, which felt like a gift. She was good at it. She had known she was good at it in St. Louis, but there the training hospital had been full of trained physicians who made the decisions, and she had only been asked to carry out instructions. Here Dr. Grady was often needed elsewhere, and she was what was available, and being what was available suited her. Arthur came to the house most evenings, not to impose, not to take anything for granted, but because she had told him where she was and he had understood what that meant. They ate supper together most nights, her cooking, which was serviceable, or his, which was surprisingly good for a man who had spent years on the trail. He cooked one evening a kind of camp bread that he said his mother had made, fried in a pan with a little fat, and she ate it and thought about a woman named Della in Colorado teaching her son to cook over a fire, and she had to be very still with herself for a moment. James arrived on the coach from Santa Fe on a Thursday morning in September, 15 years old and too thin and very happy to see her, and she hugged him for longer than he was comfortable with, which was fine, and then she introduced him to Arthur, which she had thought about carefully. James looked at Arthur the way 15-year-old boys look at men they are trying to assess, which is to say with great suspicion wrapped in an attempt to look casual. Arthur shook his hand and looked at him directly and said, "Your sister tells me you are good with horses." James brightened despite himself. He was good with horses. It was the thing he was proudest of. "Yes, sir," he said. "I will show you Copper sometime," Arthur said. "She is particular about people, but she might tolerate you." James glanced at Della with an expression that said, "All right, maybe this man is acceptable," and Della looked back at him with an expression that said, "Do not make it obvious." The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Della Grady's adult life, which she recognized even as they were happening, which was rare. She was busy and useful, and she was learning the territory and the people in it, and in the evenings Arthur was there, and the thing between them was growing with the slow, patient certainty of a desert plant, which does not rush because it does not need to, because it knows exactly what it is doing. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in October in the doorway of her house, when she had been saying good night for 5 minutes without going inside. He did it the way he did everything, without preamble or performance, but very deliberately. He cupped her face in both hands and kissed her once, and then looked at her to see what she thought. She thought a great many things simultaneously. She thought that this was probably inadvisable. She thought that she had wanted this for 6 weeks. She thought that he was a wanted man and that there was no clean future in it, and she was a practical woman who knew better. She kissed him back. He let out a breath against her forehead that felt like a very long tension releasing. "I have been careful with you," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I am going to keep being careful with you," he said, "because you deserve that." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, feeling the solid reality of him, and then she went inside and stood in her kitchen in the dark thinking about the shape of the future. What she had not told him yet, because she had not known how, was that she had written a letter to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe. Not a letter that named Arthur Norris. A careful, formal letter from a trained nurse who had come to New Mexico territory and had encountered a situation she believed represented a legal injustice, and who wished to know the proper channels for submitting evidence of prosecutorial irregularity in an existing wanted case. She had sent the letter 3 weeks earlier. She had not received a reply. 2 days after he kissed her, the reply came. It was from a deputy marshal named Elias Croft, and it was not encouraging in its specifics but was not entirely without hope. Deputy Marshal Croft wrote that cases of this nature, involving a deceased informant and allegations of setup, were difficult to prosecute retroactively, but that if she had specific evidence of timeline discrepancy in original depositions, she could submit same to the territorial court in Santa Fe, and that such evidence would be reviewed. He wrote that he could not promise any outcome, but that the federal office was not without interest in matters where the original conviction or charge had been achieved by fraudulent means. She read the letter 3 times. Then she went to Arthur. She told him everything, the letter to the marshal, the reply, what she intended to do next, which was to compile the timeline evidence she had found and submit it formally. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You did this without telling me," he said. "I did," she said. "I was not sure it would come to anything. I did not want to give you something to hope for if it was going to come to nothing." "That was not your decision to make," he said, and there was an edge in his voice that she had not heard before, a controlled anger that was not about her, she understood quickly, but was about the territory the subject occupied, all the years of being managed and manipulated by other people's decisions. "You are right," she said immediately. "I am sorry, I should have told you." The edge dissolved. He looked at her with an expression that had something helpless in it. "You are sorry," he said. Again. "You are very good at being sorry." "I am good at recognizing when I have done something wrong," she said. "That is different from being sorry simply to end a conflict." He sat down at her kitchen table and put his hands flat on it and looked at them for a moment. "What are the chances?" he said, honestly. "Honestly," she said, sitting down across from him, "I do not know. The case is old. Whitfield is dead. The original depositions would need to be retrieved from Tucson. There would need to be someone in the territorial court who was willing to look at it without prejudice." She paused. "But the discrepancy is there. It is in the official record. And someone with authority and inclination could use it." He looked at her. "Why," he said, "why are you doing this?" "Because you did not kill those men," she said. "And because you have been carrying it for 2 years and you will carry it for the rest of your life if no one does anything." She held his gaze. "And because I have a reason now to want you to have somewhere legal to stand." He understood what she meant. He looked at her with that expression she had no category for, the one that had first appeared when she said she was sorry about Cole Whitfield. "Della," he said, and it was just her name, just those 2 syllables, but the way he said it was everything. "I know," she said quietly. "I know," he stayed. That was the night they sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours and talked about everything. The real everything. Not the careful getting-to-know-you conversations they had been having for weeks, but the deeper things. The losses and the fears and the beliefs. She told him about her father dying and what it had felt like to be responsible for James from the age of 24 with nothing but training and $40 and determination. He told her about the years after the Tucson incident, the running, the constant calculation of which territory was safest, the slow erosion of anything resembling a settled life. "I stopped thinking about the future," he said, "after a while. It is easier not to." "What do you think about instead?" she asked. "The present," he said. "The next day, the next week." A pause. "That has been changing lately." She felt the full weight of what he was saying. "What does the future look like?" she asked carefully. "When you let yourself look at it now." He looked at her for a long time. "Like this," he said simply, "like some version of this." She had to breathe very carefully for a moment. "That is what I want too," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the marshal's office or the territorial court, I want you to know that I am not doing this because I expect something in return. I am doing it because it is right." "And because," she stopped. "Because," he prompted quietly. "Because I love you," she said, and felt the words land in the room with a weight and a clarity that surprised her because she had not known she was going to say them until she did. Arthur Norris went very still. "That is," he said and stopped. He tried again. "I have not." He stopped again. She waited because she understood that some things take a moment to find their way out of a man who has not said them or received them in a very long time. "I love you," he said finally. "I have been trying not to because I did not think I had the right, but I do. I love you." The kitchen was warm. Outside, the desert night was cold and deep and studded with stars, and inside the small house on the edge of Roswell, New Mexico territory, 2 people who had found each other in the dark in August sat across a scarred table and told each other the truth. The situation with Silas Creed came to a head in November. Creed had been, evidently, less deterred by Arthur's presence on the Lincoln Road than they had hoped. He had simply regrouped, gathered information, and made a different calculation. The information he gathered included the fact that Della Grady was a woman in Roswell who was regularly attended by a known wanted man, which to Creed's mind represented an opportunity. Creed sent a man to the doctor's office on a Tuesday afternoon when Arthur was at the stable, and Dr. Grady was at the Pecos Ranch attending a rancher with a broken wrist. The man's name was Abel, and he was civil enough in his delivery, which made the message worse. He told Della that Mr. Creed would like to extend an invitation for a meeting. He told her that Mr. Creed was aware of her connection to Mr. Arthur Norris, and that Mr. Creed believed they might have interests to discuss. He told her that if she declined the invitation, Mr. Creed might feel it necessary to send word to the sheriff's office in Roswell about the whereabouts of a certain wanted fugitive, which would result in complications for everyone. It was a trap. The hidden motive was as legible as a placard. Creed wanted something and was using her as the leverage to get it, and the thing he wanted, Della was nearly certain, was the removal of the one person who had successfully defied him on the Lincoln Road. She told Abel that she appreciated the invitation and would send word. Then she went to the stable and told Arthur everything. He listened without moving. "I should not have stopped at that road," he said. "If you had not stopped at that road," she said steadily, "Dr. Grady's patient would not have received care and you and I would not be standing here. So please do not say that." He looked at her. The muscle in his jaw was working. "Creed has the county sheriff," he said, "and 2 deputies who owe him. If he sends word, I have 2 hours before there are men at this house." "Then we do not give him the opportunity to send word," she said. "What do you mean?" She had thought about it in the time between Abel leaving and walking to the stable. She had thought about it clearly and practically, which was what she did under pressure. "Deputy Marshal Croft," she said. "His office is in Santa Fe, not Roswell. He has no connection to Creed, and I have been in correspondence with him about your case, which means he knows my name and has reason to take my letter seriously." She paused. "I am going to write to him today and tell him that Silas Creed, who is operating an extortion scheme on the Lincoln Road and has a county sheriff in his pocket, is attempting to use the threat of false testimony to coerce a federal witness." Arthur stared at her. "That would make you a federal witness," he said. "I have been corresponding with a deputy marshal about an active federal matter for 6 weeks, she said. "I may already be one." He was quiet for a moment, and then something happened to his expression that started with disbelief and moved through several other things and landed somewhere that looked like awe. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Write to Croft today. Take the letter to the post office yourself and do not mention it to anyone. And then we wait." "And Creed's invitation," he said. "I will send word that I need 3 days to consider," she said. "That buys time." It bought 12 days in the end. Della sent 2 more delaying messages to Creed's man, each one polite and slightly vague in the way that a woman who does not entirely understand the situation might be expected to be. She was very good at performing a lack of comprehension she did not possess. Deputy Marshal Croft's response arrived on a Wednesday. It was terse and official, and said that the marshal's office was dispatching an agent to Roswell in connection with 2 matters, one being the extortion activity on the Lincoln Road, which had evidently come to the attention of the federal office through other channels as well, and one being a review of evidence submitted regarding the 1880 Tucson charges. The agent would arrive within 2 weeks. Arthur read the letter twice. "This is because of you," he said. "This is because the evidence is real," she said. "I just made sure the right person saw it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that said everything he did not have the words for. James, coming through the back door at that moment with an armful of wood for the stove, executed a rapid retreat that they were both aware of and neither acknowledged for a period of several minutes, at which point James came back through the door making considerably more noise than before, and Arthur had moved to the window. James set the wood down and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a boy who has achieved a resolution about something. "Mr. Norris," he said formally, "are you planning to marry my sister?" "James," Della said. "I am asking because someone ought to," James said, and went through to the other room. Arthur turned from the window. His expression was very careful. "He is not wrong," he said. Della's heart was doing something it had been doing a great deal lately, which was moving too fast for dignity. "Ask me properly," she said, "when this is resolved. Ask me when you have somewhere legal to stand. And if it is not resolved—" He said, "Ask me then anyway," she said. "I will say yes either way, but I would like for it to be resolved." He nodded slowly. There was something in his eyes that was very old and very new at the same time. "All right," he said. "Either way." The federal agent arrived 16 days later, a spare, deliberate man named Hargreaves who wore a badge and carried a leather case of documents and asked questions with the precise patience of someone who does this for a living and does it well. He met with Della first, because her letters had initiated the contact, and she walked him through everything she had found in the wanted poster and the timeline discrepancy, and what she understood of the circumstances of the Tucson incident. Hargreaves asked careful questions and wrote careful notes. Then he met with Arthur, which Della was not present for but which Arthur reported afterward had lasted 2 hours and covered everything including Cole Whitfield and the setup, and the 3 men who had died, and every detail of the sequence of events in March of 1880. Hargreaves also spent 3 days riding through the Lincoln Road territory, accompanied by 2 additional federal officers who had come with him, conducting interviews with travelers and merchants who had been subject to Creed's tolling. This part of the investigation was publicly visible, and the news of it spread through Roswell and the surrounding country with the speed that news moves through small communities, which is to say very fast. Silas Creed made the mistake of sending men to dissuade the federal agents, which was the kind of mistake that transforms a territorial extortion matter into an obstruction of federal process charge. And Hargreaves was very clear in his report, which he filed within the week, about the obstruction. 2 weeks after Hargreaves left Roswell, Creed was arrested by federal marshals in Lincoln. The county sheriff who had been on his payroll resigned rather than face investigation. The toll on the Lincoln Road dissolved overnight, as toll arrangements tend to do when the man requiring the toll is in a federal holding facility. The other matter took longer. 3 months. 3 months of correspondence between the territorial court in Santa Fe and the federal office and the original sheriff's office in Tucson, of retrieving original documents and examining timelines and depositions. 3 months during which Arthur Norris remained in Roswell and worked, legitimately, as a stable hand for Horace and as occasional help for Dr. Grady, who had discovered that Arthur had a steadier hand in crisis situations than most trained men and was not shy about using him. 3 months during which James Grady turned 16 and grew 2 inches, and developed a passionate interest in the training techniques for working horses that Arthur demonstrated with a patience for the boy that Della found, if she was being honest, deeply moving. 3 months during which Della delivered 4 babies and set 14 broken things, and sat with 2 dying men, and vaccinated 37 children against smallpox, in a community effort that Dr. Grady said was the most successful public health initiative in Roswell's short history. 3 months during which she and Arthur moved between her house and the stable and Dr. Grady's office and the open land around town, building a life in the way that lives are actually built, not in grand gestures but in the accumulation of ordinary days that become, when you are paying attention, extraordinary. On a February evening in 1883, Arthur came to the house with an expression that told her the letter had arrived before he opened his mouth. He put it on the table between them. It was from the territorial court in Santa Fe. She picked it up. She read it twice. The case against Arthur Norris, formerly of Colorado, in relation to the events of March 14, 1880, in Tucson, Arizona Territory, including the charges of robbery and conspiracy, was dismissed on the basis of newly reviewed evidence indicating that the primary witness in the case, the late Cole Whitfield, had engaged in deliberate deception of law enforcement, and that the timeline of events as documented in the original depositions did not support the charges as filed. The murder charge, which had never been formally indicted due to insufficient direct evidence, was formally declared absent of basis. Arthur Norris was no longer a wanted man in the Arizona Territory, the New Mexico Territory, or any jurisdiction of the federal government. She set the letter down. She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, and she realized after a moment that she was looking at Arthur Norris without the weight of it. 2 years of running, of false identity and careful roots, and the constant management of exposure and risk lifted. He looked younger. He looked, for a moment, like the young man she had imagined when she thought about him at 17. She stood up and went to him, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some moments are too full for words, and the attempt to fill them only diminishes them. James, who had been in the other room and had apparently gathered from the quality of the silence that something significant had happened, appeared in the doorway and looked at them, and then at the letter on the table. He picked it up and read it, and his face did several things in rapid succession. "Right then," he said, with the elaborate casualness of a 16-year-old managing an emotion he did not entirely have the vocabulary for. "I am going to go see to Copper." He went out the back door, and they heard him in the yard, and then he was gone. Arthur pulled back and looked at her. He reached into his coat pocket and took out something folded and put it on the table next to the letter from the territorial court. It was a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was a bill of sale and registration document for one dark bay mare, name Copper, age 7, registered in the state of records of Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory. Her name was at the bottom, Della Grady. She looked up at him with a complicated feeling in her chest that was not the feeling she had expected when she read the words. "What is this?" She whispered. "You can read," he said. "You know what it is." "Arthur," she said. He took a breath. "I have been carrying the dark past long enough to know that things can go wrong fast," he said. "Even now, even with this." He indicated the court letter. "I wanted you to have something solid, something that was yours that no one could take from question. Copper is 40 miles of running if you ever need it. She is registered in your name now. No one can argue it." She looked at him, and she understood what it was. It was not departure. It was not a goodbye. It was the opposite. It was a man who had spent 2 years with nothing of his own handing the most valuable thing he possessed to the woman he loved and saying, "Here, take this, because your safety matters more than anything I own." It was also the most romantically impractical gesture she had ever received, because what she wanted was not a horse registered in her name. "Arthur Norris," she said, "I am not interested in Copper's papers." He looked at her. "I am interested," she said, "in what you were going to ask me when this was resolved." The corner of his mouth moved, the thing that was not quite a smile but was more than adjacent to one. "Della Grady," he said, and his voice was low and certain and full of everything he had been carrying and learning to put down. "I have nothing to offer you that is not complicated. I have a name that is free now but was not. I have a history that does not read simply. I have James's provisional tolerance, which I believe I have earned but which he has made clear is conditional on my continued good behavior." The not quite smile deepened. "I have Copper, though I appear to have just given her away." She laughed, and it came out wet, which was a surprise. "I have loved you," he said, "since approximately the second morning in the stable in Roswell, when you brought me coffee and did not say anything about the wanted poster, and I have been trying to be worthy of that love in every way I know how. I would like to keep trying, for a very long time." He paused. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, before the word was even fully out of his mouth, and he made a sound that she had never heard from him before, a low, involuntary exhale that was relief and joy and release all at once. He kissed her, which was becoming familiar and was also every time completely new, and she put her hands on his face and kissed him back. Outside, she heard James's footsteps stop at the back door and then, wisely, continue on. They were married in March of 1883 in Roswell, New Mexico Territory, by a circuit preacher named Father Domings who had a kind face and did not ask complicated questions about Arthur's previous history, which Della appreciated. Dr. Grady gave the bride away, which he did with enormous solemnity and the barely suppressed emotion of a man who had become, over the preceding months, genuinely fond of both parties. James stood as Arthur's witness, because he had decided that his provisional tolerance had become unconditional somewhere around November, and had the dignity to act on it without making a speech about it. Della wore a dress she had made herself from a dark blue wool she had ordered from Santa Fe, because dark blue wool was practical and warm, and she had never in her life seen the point of wearing something you could only wear once. Arthur wore his best coat, which she had mended in the left elbow, and he had shaved, which transformed his face in a way that she had not anticipated, and which she found she needed a moment to adjust to. He looked cleaned up and standing straight in the morning light of the Roswell church, like a man who had decided to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. She loved him desperately. They moved into the house on the edge of town, all three of them, which was somewhat crowded but manageable, and Arthur began to talk seriously with Dr. Grady about the possibility of establishing a proper stable and horse training operation in Roswell, which was growing fast enough that such a business had real prospects. The doctor provided an introduction to a banker named Whitmore who was cautiously interested in new ventures, and Arthur spent 2 months producing a business plan of such careful and detailed precision that Whitmore, who had expected a half-literate cowhand, had to visibly recalibrate his assessment. The loan was approved in May. By June of 1883, Arthur Norris's horse training and stable was operating out of a new structure on the south end of Roswell, handling 6 horses and a growing list of clients who had heard through the particular efficiency of small-town word of mouth that the man at the new stable had a quality with horses that was worth paying for. James worked there after school and on weekends, and Arthur taught him with the same quiet patience that characterized everything he did, and James absorbed it with the focused attention of a boy who has found a calling. Della continued her work with Dr. Grady through that summer and into the fall, and in September the doctor told her that he was going to write to a medical college in Kansas City and recommend them create a position for a trained female nursing practitioner, because he intended to retire within 2 years and someone would need to run the practice, and he believed she was the most qualified person for the task. He did not ask her if she was interested. He told her he was doing it in the way of a man who knows what he knows. She told Arthur that evening, and he looked at her with an expression of complete unsurprise. "Of course he is," he said. "It is very unusual," she said. "A woman running a medical practice." "You are very unusual," he said, and said it as the straightforward fact it was. In November of 1883 she told him she was expecting a child. He went very still in the way he went still when something hit him somewhere important, and then he moved to her and held her with both arms in a way that was different from any embrace she had experienced before, carefully enclosing, as though she contained something precious and irreplaceable. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "Perfectly well," she said. "I am a nurse. I am aware of all the things that can go wrong and I am monitoring them carefully. I am also aware that most things go right." "All right," he said, and she felt him breathe. James, when told the following day, made a face that was mostly excitement masked by an attempt to appear sophisticated about it, and then asked if the baby would share his room, and when they said probably not, he visibly relaxed. The winter of 1883 and the spring of 1884 passed in the warmth of a life being built. The stable grew to 12 horses. Dr. Grady's practice brought a second set of hands in the form of a young man named Tomas Vargas who had trained in El Paso and was capable and conscientious, and who, Della noted with satisfaction, had a particular quality of care with the town's Mexican and Apache patients that she had been working to cultivate. She supervised him with the same combination of exactness and patience that Dr. Grady had used with her. James turned 17 in March and announced that he intended to become a veterinarian, which was both a surprise and, in retrospect, obvious. Arthur immediately began making inquiries about schools, which James did not know about and which touched Della in a way that made her have to leave the kitchen for a moment. Her son was born on the morning of April 14th, 1884, which was a Tuesday and a fine morning with the desert light coming gold through the east window of the bedroom, where she had arranged everything exactly as she wanted it. Dr. Grady was present, and Arthur, and a local woman named Mrs. Firo who had attended 12 birthings and whose calm Della found invaluable. The labor was long but not complicated, and when it was over and the baby was in her arms, red-faced and indignant and already loud about it, she looked at Arthur sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with his hand resting next to hers, and his face doing something that she did not have a prior example for and did not need one. "Hello," she said to the baby, who did not respond in language but had opinions about the light. "Hello," Arthur said, not to the baby, to her, in the voice that was just for her. "What is his name going to be, Doctor?" Grady asked from his corner. She looked at Arthur. "William," Arthur said. "For my father," he paused, "if that is agreeable." "William Arthur Norris," she said, trying it. "Yes, that is his name." William Arthur Norris screamed his objection to the entire world with great conviction, which Dr. Grady said was an excellent sign, and Mrs. Firo confirmed. And Della held him and looked at her husband and thought about every road that had led here, every dark mile and every scared breath, and every moment she had nearly turned back or given up. The wanted poster that had once hung in the window of the Roswell Sheriff's office was gone, replaced by no poster and no memory that the law chose to maintain. Arthur Norris was a businessman now, a horse trainer, a husband, a father, a man with a name that was his own without weight attached to it. He reached out and very gently put one finger against William's small-fisted hand, and the baby grabbed it with the reflexive grip of the newborn, and Arthur looked at that tiny grip on his finger with an expression that said everything about what had been given back to him. James appeared in the doorway and looked at his nephew and made a valiant attempt at composure. "He is very small," James said. "They start that way," Arthur said without looking up. James came into the room and sat in the chair by the window and looked at William with the expression of a young man realizing that something has changed permanently and deciding he is all right with it. By the summer of 1884, Roswell had grown considerably, with new settlers arriving from the east and the railroad's impending arrival beginning to shift the economy of the territory. Arthur's stable had become the premier horse operation in the region, supplying trained horses to ranchers and businesses across Lincoln County, and he had hired 3 men who worked for him, and whom he treated with the straightforward fairness that earned genuine loyalty. Della had taken over the primary management of Dr. Grady's practice in all but name, with the doctor's enthusiastic endorsement and Tomas Vargas's partnership, and the Kansas City College had sent a letter indicating that a formal training certification was available to practicing nurses who could demonstrate documented clinical hours, which Della had in considerable quantity. She completed the certification by correspondence, which the college permitted in exceptional circumstances, and received her credentials in August. She was, by any measure, the most qualified medical practitioner operating in Roswell, New Mexico territory. She was also a woman in 1884, which meant there were people who were committed to not acknowledging this, and she dealt with those people with the specific patient firmness she had developed over years of navigating that particular variety of willful blindness. Arthur dealt with them differently when the situation warranted. He dealt with them with a quality of stillness and certainty that tended to end most conversations before they became problems. He was not a violent man. He had no interest in violence, but he carried, even now, the residue of the years when he had needed to be capable of it, and that residue expressed itself as a quality of presence that most men, whatever their views on female medical practitioners, found it easiest to simply work around. In the fall of 1884, they received a letter from James, who had gone to Kansas City for the fall semester of a veterinary course that Arthur had funded entirely from the stable income, without telling James this until the acceptance letter arrived. James's letter described his classes with breathless enthusiasm and said he had met a young woman named Rosa who was the daughter of a cattle rancher and who was, in James's careful language, very interesting. Della read this to Arthur over breakfast. "Rosa," Arthur said. "That is all he gives us," Della confirmed. "He will tell us more," Arthur said, "when he has figured out what he wants to tell us." "You are very wise about men," she said. "I am wise about having things to say that you are not ready to say," he said simply. She looked at him across the breakfast table, with William in her lap chewing on a wooden spoon that he had claimed as his personal property and would not be separated from, and felt the particular quality of happiness that comes from knowing that the life you are living is the one you actually want, not the one you settled for or the one you had to build out of what was available. This was what she had wanted, exactly this. "I never thanked you properly," she said. He looked up from his coffee. "For the horse," she said, "for Copper and the papers. I was angry at the time because I thought it meant you were leaving, but it was not that." "No," he said. "It was the most Arthur Norris way of saying you loved me that you had yet managed," she said, which was saying something. He considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. "I am better at saying it directly now," he said. "You are," she agreed. "You are much improved." He gave her the full version of the not-quite smile, the one that had evolved over the past year and a half into something that was actually a smile, and it hit her in the chest the same way it always had. William grabbed a fistful of her dress and made a declarative sound. "I know," she told him. "Breakfast." December of 1884 brought a Christmas that was the first Christmas Della had not spent in the shadow of grief or worry in 4 years. And she recognized this explicitly on Christmas morning, when she woke up to the smell of coffee Arthur was making in the kitchen, and the sound of William attempting to have a conversation with Copper through the window that faced the small corral. Because William had decided at 7 months that Copper was his particular friend, and Copper, who was indeed particular about people, had apparently decided the same thing about him. Dr. Grady came for Christmas dinner with his sister-in-law who had come down from Albuquerque, and Tomas Vargas brought his wife Elena, and 3 of the men from the stable came with their families, and the small house that had once been a 2-room space for one woman with $40 and a lot of determination held 11 adults and 4 children, and was completely full and completely alive. After dinner, when the guests had gone and James's letter had been read aloud to everyone because it arrived that afternoon and described Rosa with rather less restraint than previous letters, and William was asleep in his crib in the back room, Della and Arthur sat on the porch steps in the cold December dark and looked at the stars. The sky over Roswell was still extraordinary. She had never gotten used to it. "That first night," she said, "on the road to Roswell. When you came out of the dark on Copper." "Yes," he said. "What were you actually doing on that road?" she asked. "In August at night heading south." He was quiet for a moment. "Running," he said. "There had been word in Santa Fe that a marshal's man had made inquiries about my location. I was putting territory between us." A pause. "I had been running for so long that I did not really have a destination. I was just moving." "And you stopped," she said. "I heard breathing," he said. "And then I heard the men below the coach and I made a calculation." "What calculation?" He looked at her. In the dark his face was the face she had mapped completely in the past year and a half, every line and quality of it, the things it did when he was tired and when he was amused and when he was moved and when he was thinking. "That I had been running long enough," he said, "and that something was asking me to stop." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I am glad you stopped," she said. He put his arm around her. So am I, he said. Above them the stars were indifferent and vast and magnificent in the way they always were, and in the house behind them, William made a small sound in his sleep and was quiet again, and the dark bay mare in the corral shifted her weight and breathed, registered in the name of Della Norris, born Della Grady, who had come west with $40 and no plan except to keep herself and her brother alive, and had found, on a dark road in August, everything she had not known she was also looking for. The new year came in cold and clear, and 1885 arrived over the New Mexico territory with the indifferent grandeur of a country that has been here longer than any human arrangement imposed upon it and will be here long after. In Roswell the town grew. The railroad, which had been promised and delayed and promised again, made genuine progress and was expected within 2 years. Arthur expanded the stable to accommodate 20 horses, and Della hired a second nursing practitioner from El Paso to help Tomas with the growing patient load. James came home from Kansas City in the spring with his first semester's certificates and a photograph. In the photograph was Rosa. She was dark-haired and direct-eyed and standing next to a horse with the ease of someone who had grown up with horses, and she was looking at the camera with an expression that suggested she found the requirement to hold still for the photograph somewhat beneath her. Della loved her immediately and on pure instinct. "She is coming to visit in June," James said, in the tone of a young man who has made a decision and is informing his family of it as a courtesy. "Good," Arthur said with the brevity of a man who has reached his conclusions. James looked at him. "You have not even met her." "No," Arthur said, "but you are smiling in a way I recognize." He looked up. "Bring her in June." James did. Rosa arrived in June on the coach from Santa Fe, which had better service now that the route was more established, and she was exactly what the photograph suggested. Direct, capable, with a laugh that came easily and a quality of attention that reminded Della, in the best possible way, of a younger version of herself. She and Della got along immediately and completely, which James received with a relief that he managed to hide for approximately 3 hours before abandoning the attempt. Rosa spent 2 weeks in Roswell, and by the end of the first week had made herself useful in the stable in the mornings and the medical practice in the afternoons, because she was constitutionally incapable of being idle, and Arthur looked at this and then looked at Della with a very clear expression. "I know," Della said. William, who was 14 months old and had strong opinions about everyone, accepted Rosa with his characteristic directness on the second day by walking up to her in the yard and extending his wooden spoon as an offering. Rosa took it solemnly and handed it back, which was the correct response. "He likes you," Della told her. "Horses and babies," Rosa said, "have good instincts." The question of Rosa and James resolved itself as these things do over time. James finished his veterinary course. Rosa's father, a practical man who had assessed James Grady and found him capable and decent, gave his blessing. They were married in the spring of 1886 in Kansas City and came to Roswell afterward, because James was joining Arthur's operation as the stable's official veterinarian and Rosa was interested in the medical practice, which was more than enough work for everyone. Dr. Grady retired properly in the fall of 1886, with a dinner in his honor at the hotel and a speech by the mayor that went on somewhat long but meant well. He moved to Albuquerque to be near his sister-in-law, and sent cheerful letters every few weeks that arrived with a regularity Della found comforting. In March of 1887, Della told Arthur she was expecting again, and he received this news with the same concentrated stillness and careful joy he had received it the first time. "William is going to have opinions about sharing the room," she said. "He will adjust," Arthur said. "He adapted to the spoon situation." This was a reference to William having reluctantly allowed Rosa access to the spoon, which was a significant concession for a child who treated the object as a diplomatic tool and a symbol of personal sovereignty. Their second child, a daughter born in October of 1887, was named Clara Ellen Norris. Ellen for Della's mother and Clara because it was a clear, clean name, and she arrived on a clear, clean October morning, and it suited her. William inspected his sister with the grave professional thoroughness of a 2.5-year-old who takes his responsibilities seriously, and declared her acceptable. By 1888, Roswell was a genuinely established town, no longer a frontier outpost but a real community with a school and 2 churches and a bank and a post office, and a newspaper and 3 doctors, of whom Della Norris was the one most likely to be called at any hour of the day or night, and the one most likely to already know what was wrong before she arrived, because she had built, over 6 years of practice, a comprehensive understanding of this community and its people. Arthur's stable had become, as he had promised banker Whitmore it would, the best horse operation in Lincoln County. He trained cutting horses for ranchers and coached riders, and occasionally served as the quiet authority on disputes regarding horse valuation or condition that came to him, because everyone knew he would give a straight answer regardless of whose interest it served. He was respected in Roswell in the way that men are respected who do what they say they will do, and do not say things they do not mean. He was also, Della knew, deeply and specifically happy in a way that he had not been when she first found him on that road, which had been the happiness of a man who has simply stopped expecting anything and has settled into the flat endurance of it. This happiness was different. It was full. It was inhabited. One evening in late spring of 1888, with William 4 years old and Clara 6 months, and the long blue dusk of a New Mexico evening settling over Roswell and the sound of the stable quiet and the smell of supper on the stove, Arthur came in from the corral and sat at the kitchen table and watched her for a moment. "What?" she said, not looking up from the bread she was cutting. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She set the bread knife down and looked at him. He looked back. "I was thinking," he said, "about that road in August." "What about it?" "That I almost did not stop," he said. "That I heard the men and I thought, not my concern, keep moving, you cannot afford the attention." He paused. "And then I heard you breathing." She waited. "And something," he said, "would not let me keep moving." She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him at the table where they had sat on the night she told him she loved him, and he told her the same, and she took his hands in hers. "Whatever that something was," she said, "I am grateful to it." "So am I," he said, and looked at their hands together on the scarred wood of the table. The folded papers were long since placed in the tin box where Della kept important documents, the land deed and the stable papers, and the certificates and the birth records, and the letter from the territorial court, and the marriage certificate, and now the veterinary certificates, and everything else that constituted the accumulated legal reality of the life they had built. She had transferred Copper's registration back to Arthur 6 months after he gave it to her, on the grounds that the crisis had passed, and the gesture had been received and understood, and she saw no reason for Arthur Norris to be without his horse's papers. He had looked at the transferred papers and then at her. "You transferred her back," he said. "You need a horse in your own name," she said practically. "You have a business to run." He had laughed. It was the sound she liked best in the world, followed closely by William's specific laugh when he found something genuinely funny in Clara's new sound that was almost a laugh but not quite yet. Copper was 15 in 1888 and still sound and particular, and Arthur treated her with the same patient attention he had always given her. She was, in some ways, the original evidence of the kind of man he was, that dark bay mare who had carried him on a road at night in August and stopped because he stopped. Registered in Della's name for 6 months and then back in his, with the understanding between them that the gesture had been what it was, a man saying "I love you" in the most practical language he knew, and a woman who was practical enough herself to receive it correctly. They were not a perfect story. There was no such thing. There had been the months of difficulty with the law and creed and the waiting. There had been the adjustments of 3 people becoming a household, and then 5, and then more. There had been nights when Arthur woke from something dark that lived in the years before Roswell, and she lay beside him in the dark, and did not demand he describe it, but simply put her hand against his back and let him find his way back to the present. There had been days when she was exhausted in the particular way of women who carry both professional work and household life, and are sometimes angry about having to carry both, and sometimes simply too tired to be angry. They had learned each other in the way that real partnerships are built, which is not by finding perfection, but by finding someone whose imperfections you can work alongside, whose darkness you can sit in without being consumed by it, whose light is the kind that illuminates rather than blinds. In the summer of 1889, New Mexico Territory was in the early discussions that would lead eventually toward statehood, and the sense of the country changing, of the frontier closing and something else beginning, was in the air of Roswell the way weather is in the air before it arrives. Della thought sometimes about the woman who had stood on the boardwalk and looked at a wanted poster and then gone and knocked on a door, who had brought a man coffee in a stable and asked about a road and decided on the basis of no logical evidence that something about him was true. She thought about $40 and a tin of medical supplies and a knife in her boot and a brother waiting in Santa Fe and a borrowed sorrel with a soft leg and a dark bay mare that was registered in her name now and would carry her 40 miles if she needed to run. She had not needed to run. She had needed to stop. They both had. William brought a frog home in September and installed it in the kitchen with the confidence of a child who does not anticipate objections, and there was a discussion about the frog's appropriate habitat that concluded with the frog residing in the corral, where it apparently found conditions suitable. Clara pulled herself upright for the first time using the leg of the kitchen table, and made a sound that was unambiguous triumph, and Arthur caught her before she fell and held her up, and looked at her with a complete and transparent joy that Della would carry for the rest of her life. James wrote from the east side of town, where he and Rosa had their own house now, that Rosa was expecting in the spring, and the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Della read it twice and then went next door to Rosa, and they sat together at Rosa's table with coffee, and talked about it with the frank practicality of medical women and the warm emotion of family, which are not opposites. The stable had a waiting list for trained horses. The medical practice had 3 practitioners. James Vargas would take his veterinary examinations in the fall. The railroad would arrive. It was now confirmed, in 1890. Arthur found her in the garden one evening in October where she was cutting back the late-season plants with the focused efficiency she brought to garden work as to everything else, and he stood at the gate for a moment watching her before she looked up. "What?" she said. "Letter from Hargreaves," he said. "The deputy marshal." She straightened. "What does it say?" "He has been transferred to Washington," he said. "He writes to say it was a privilege to be involved in a case where the evidence was so clearly and carefully assembled." He paused. "He says, and I am quoting directly, that whoever put together the timeline analysis is a credit to the principle that truth can be retrieved from even old and apparently settled matters." She put her garden knife in her pocket. "He does not know it was you," Arthur said. "He does not need to," she said. He opened the gate and came into the garden and stood in front of her and looked at her with everything in his face that was always in his face, the specific quality of the life they had built together, all the mornings and evenings and the ordinary and the extraordinary mixed together in the way that they always are. "Thank you," he said, "for that, for all of it." "You would have done the same," she said, "if the situation had been reversed." "I would have tried," he said. "You were better at it than I would have been." "Yes," she agreed, because it was true and she had learned not to be modest about the things that were true. He kissed her there in the October garden with the smell of turned earth and dry grass, and the long gold light of the desert evening around them. And inside the house, William was talking to Clara through the window of her room in the particular one-sided conversation of a 4-year-old explaining the world to a baby. And Copper moved in the corral with the sound of a horse that knows exactly where home is. And the sky over New Mexico Territory was the color of everything that had ever been possible. The life they built was real, and it was theirs, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly what love looks like when you stop running and start staying, when you hand someone the most valuable thing you have and say, "This is yours now, take it. I trust you with it," and they hand it back and say, "Yes, and also I am staying too." That is the whole of it. That is how the hardened outlaw gave her his horse papers and said, "This animal is registered in your name now," and how it was the beginning of everything, and how they stayed in Roswell, New Mexico territory, and built a life that neither of them had believed on a dark road in August of 1882 was still available to them. It was. It had been there all along, waiting for them to stop moving long enough to find it.